Must you behave so much like children? So, I kind of want to talk a little bit about something that comes up in the comment section every now and then, which is that sometimes I will describe a Doctor Who episode or an element in an episode as being too silly. And anytime I do that, I can be guaranteed there's at least going to be a handful of comments of people saying something to the effect of, Doctor Who's supposed to be silly, or you're okay with what goes on in this episode, but not this one. How is this any sillier? Or things of that nature. So I kind of want to address at least my own assessment of Doctor Who's relationship with being silly. Because let's first openly acknowledge it is a bit of a silly show. And part of that has to do with the nature of ridiculous high-concept sci-fi premises. They honestly tend to be a bit silly. And then there's also the fact that it was originally designed as a kid's show, and at this point I would consider it family entertainment. So there is an element of that as well, and oftentimes when writers can't think of another way to do it, they will get silly and ridiculous as an appeal to a younger or a family audience. So silliness is kind of baked into this, at least to a certain degree. Certainly now, but I think that's part of the thing. I feel like the show tries to be deliberately silly a bit more now in modern Who than it used to. Because, at least for the classic Who that I've taken in, I'm still filling in gaps. It's going to be a while till I've seen all of classic Who. The thing is, though, that most classic Who that I've seen, even at its silliest, is presenting it as serious. Whereas modern Doctor Who, not always, but sometimes, presents its silliness as silliness. And I think that's the thing. When I say that something is a bit too silly, I usually mean more the execution rather than the concept, because pretty much all these concepts are silly. But by and large, when it oversteps and it feels silly as opposed to feels fun, comes down to the execution. There are some things that are one-off just ridiculousness, and I can usually roll with that, assuming that it doesn't, like, derail a whole thing. Like, it threw me off a little bit in The Woman Who Lived, that the alien in that looked like a Thundercat. That threw me off a little bit, but, you know, whatever. It's a cat alien. We've had cat aliens before. Fine. Is it a little silly? Yes, but it's not so silly that it takes me out. So I think a good example for something where it's presented as silly is Love and Monsters. Because I think when silly works, assuming that it's more than just like a joke, like a single one-off joke, although even sometimes those can get too silly, I might get to that too, it works best when, despite the silliness, the show and the characters take this seriously, because oftentimes there's a lot of silliness put in that is inherent in the villains, the threat, things like that. So the characters need to take that seriously, because if they act like the threat is silly, then what are the stakes? Why do we care? So coming back to Love and Monsters, you could certainly argue that the characters, in Linda, who are, the guy who's actually fleeing the Absorbaloff, is taking this serious because his life's in danger. But that's not enough, because the way it's presented, the way the Absorbaloff is played, the way he's shot, the way he lumbers in broad daylight, the way they have an extended joke about what to even call him, the way the Doctor kind of smirks and snarks, the fact that the Doctor and Rose only show up because this guy irritated or annoyed Rose's mother, not to actually stop this thing. It makes it silly and incidental, and in a way that doesn't draw you in, but in a way that, well, nothing about this is being taken seriously. The show isn't taking it seriously. The heroes aren't taking it seriously. The monster doesn't seem to take himself seriously. And I'm not saying that can never work in any medium, but that, to me, is too silly for Doctor Who to work. So, not everybody does. But I, personally, quite like the episode Robots of Sherwood. And there's a lot of silliness in that. I mean, it's got the line, "I'm the doctor and this is my spoon." That's incredibly silly. The way Robin Hood behaves and his merrymen behave at all is very silly. But the way that causes things to happen in the episode is it brings a bitter annoyance out of the doctor. So he's not just looking at this and rolling his eyes and not taking it seriously. He's reacting to it. And then, of course, the threat is a legitimate threat. And the silliness in that case is kind of separate from the threat. Now, I said when the show gets too silly, it's usually, or when I feel it gets too silly. All this is opinion, by the way, if that wasn't clear already. But when I say that it gets too silly, I usually mean this idea is too silly. Fear Her kind of falls under the same thing to a certain degree. In that case, they actually did take it quite seriously, but that was a case where the inherent idea of just a scribble monster, it felt like a Goosebumps episode. The concept felt too silly. And I suspect for a lot of people, they felt, and I'm projecting here because I actually like this episode, but I think a lot of people's issues with closing time is a combination of the concept of Cybermen under a mall being too silly, coupled with the inherent silliness of having Craig back. And again, that one worked for me, but I suspect that's part of the reason people don't like that. But sometimes there are specific moments that themselves are too silly, even if the overall concepts aren't. And I think the best example of that is actually in the very first episode of the revised series. It's in Rose, and it's when the trash bin eats Mickey. And it's not silly because the CGI is wonky, because it's Doctor Who. Yeah, the effects are wonky sometimes. And the reason it's silly is because the trash can burps. What? And that is taking it, because, I mean, Classic Who would have played that as a horror moment. Mickey would have, screamed, "Ah!" and it just would have been, and he's gone. And we're not entirely sure what happened. And that moment would not have been played for comedy. Now, you could say it's so silly that they might as well lean into it, but for me, having the thing burp, it's a step too far. That is trying to hang a lampshade on your inherent silliness. And if I use that phrase sometimes. If you're not familiar with the phrase, the idea of lampshade hanging is that something is off. Something is not working. But rather than fix it, you draw attention to it in a way that kind of lets you off the hook for it. So, I mean, where the idea comes from is, you have this thing in a room that doesn't belong there. You just stick a lampshade on it. And you've now drawn attention to the fact that it's out of place, and people are like, "Oh, you made a thing out of it. Okay, I get it now." That's sort of the idea of lampshade hanging. But the inherent problem with lampshade hanging is you didn't fix the problem. You just got weird and ironic and snarky about it. And you can get away with that sometimes, but generally, at least for me, lampshade hanging fails more often than it succeeds. Because if something is so ridiculous that you need to take that approach to make it palpable, maybe go back to formula so that it's a little less ridiculous in the first place, so that you don't have to make a joke out of it in order for it to work. So, Doctor Who is a silly show. It will always be a silly show. It should be a silly show. It can also be a very dark and serious show, and I appreciate that. But when it overleans on it, and in another episode, God, I've got a lot of the worst examples for me are in Davies's run, and especially in Series 2. And I don't need to be picking on Davies, but I mean, fair's fair, he did silly a lot more than Moffat did silly, and that's not me saying Moffat is automatically better. Moffat had his own issues, but being too silly was rarely one of them. Being too complicated and taking himself too seriously, that could be a problem, but that's opposite side of the coin. So with something like The Idiot's Lantern, I know people have said that I can't relate to this because I'm American, and I'm prepared to accept that, but I can only speak from my perspective. And from my perspective, the father in that episode is so over-the-top, blustering, caricature, cartoonish that the whole thing becomes silly. Rather than, somebody just going a little bit too far to protect his reputation and his sense of authority in the home, it is played so big that it becomes ridiculous, it becomes silly, and in that case it removes a fair amount of the stakes. He is so cartoonish, there's, to me, no catharsis when people stand up to him, because he's ridiculous. He feels unreal. That's what makes that silly. In addition to the fact that The Wire does almost nothing except go, "Feed me!" God, the number of times she repeats that, I can't. Again, it makes it silly. And I actually really like the concept of The Wire, but the execution is very, very silly. And sometimes silly works. Silly works in doses. I think oftentimes when silly works best is when there's an acknowledgement of the silliness of a specific scenario, a specific moment, a specific setting. But probably best not to have the villain, the threat, be silly. Because that's kind of what I keep coming back to. Because the burping trash can, that's supposed to be a threat, but it's made silly. The scribble monster, it's supposed to be a threat. It's too silly. The Absorbaloff is supposed to be a threat. It's played silly. The Wire and that father, they're supposed to be threats. They're played silly. And I just think that to balance the elements of Doctor Who, because there's a lot at play in Doctor Who, because there is tinges of horror and death and social commentary, and don't tell me like, oh, it's new. Like I have a whole video explaining why there's always been social and political commentary in this show, but there's that, and there is a playfulness. There's all these elements, and balancing them is very, very difficult. And I think at times things do get silly, and they can get too silly. It is possible to be too silly. It's possible to be too serious. It's possible to lean too hard into the horror. I would say that was part of what was wrong with Sleep No More, to the point that it actually aped a trendy, gimmicky horror gimmick in terms of how it was shot. So any one of these elements can be over-leaned on, but none of them should be dropped. I would never argue get rid of all the silliness in Doctor Who, because it's part of the identity of the show. But it can't overstep. And for me, when the show gets too silly, it's one of the more painful things to have to sit through. So for some reason, for me, for all the oversteps and over emphasis that the various elements of Doctor Who can sometimes get from episode to episode, overemphasizing the silly just grates me a bit more than overemphasizing the emotional dramatics, the horror elements, even the political messaging, which can get heavy-handed and can be distracting, but ultimately I get more annoyed when I just feel this is too silly. But that's me. This ramble had probably less of a point even than I usually have talking about Doctor Who, but hey, what are you gonna do? What are your thoughts? What do you think about when Doctor Who gets silly? What do you think are some of the silliest moments of Doctor Who, whether they worked for you or not? Or are there other things that Doctor Who as a show sometimes overemphasizes that you think is a bigger offense than being too silly? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's all this stuff to do. You know what it is. I've got a Patreon. That's kind of the big one. But there are links to that and a whole bunch of other stuff down in the description. So remember, folks, the council is all of you. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.